might be watching this as a recording later. You're here for a history of early baseball in Illinois with Bob Sampson, who is a historian, journalist, and baseball expert. And he has a book coming out later this year that I'm hoping he'll give me a nudge to remind me that it's been published so we can purchase it to have it in our collection. I'm going to let Bob take over from here. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat and I will, relay them to Bob at the end, or you can come on and talk to him personally. I will leave that entirely up to you. But without further ado, it's all you, Bob.
Thank you. I will see if I can get this little PowerPoint up, because there's now a rule in the academic world that you cannot do something like this unless you have a PowerPoint. Otherwise, they chase you away. Okay, can everybody see that? Okay. Should be seeing a picture that says early baseball in LaSalle County.
Yes.
Great. So I'm going to do this. I was going to do this anyway, the same way, sort of informally. And some of you maybe recognize this scene, and we'll talk more about it later. But that is, as near as I can determine, the site of the most frequently used baseball field in Ottawa. So if you're familiar with Ottawa, that building on the other side, that's the Fox River. That building is now, I think, an office building of some sort. This land would be just north and a little west of Ottawa Township High School. And we'll see a picture of it later on as to how it might have looked at the time. All right. So what is this game? Where did it come from? And why did it become so important and successful? And I guess from our particular interest tonight, what did it consist of in LaSalle County in Peru, and LaSalle and Ottawa and Mendota and places now that you have to sort of dig around to find. This is not obviously LaSalle County. This is one of the most popular early baseball fields. It's called Elysian Fields. It was in Hoboken, New Jersey. All this now is under pavement, but if you go to they're somewhere about where this home plate was, they have some tiles laid down, and it's honored. And these are two, I can't read, I should have already looked this up before. These are two teams. This is a game in 1866. So as I'm talking here for a while, look at this maybe, and maybe make mental notes or write something down. What is different about this picture than the game you see today on television or in person, whether it's an amateur game or a professional baseball game? So where did it come from? Why and where baseball? Well, there have been numbers of books written about this, and so I can give you a very quick summary. And the first point, remember, is it had nothing whatsoever to do with Cooperstown, New York, or Abner Doubleday. In fact, there is no evidence to indicate in any way that Abner Doubleday ever played a baseball game in his life, and he certainly was not in Cooperstown, New York in 1839, because we know for a fact that in 1839, Abner Doubleday, later a famous Civil War general, was at West Point, learning how to be a soldier. Now, there's lots of reasons as to why this whole Doubleday myth was created. Well, if not Doubleday, this game, where did it come from? There's lots of roots for it. And in fact, you can actually go back to ancient Egypt, and on hieroglyphics, we have examples of a game being played with a bat and ball in ancient Egypt. And over the centuries and in different places, these, what we might call bat and ball games or bat and stick games that involve some running, are common in all sorts of cultures, from India to Northern Africa to a number of European nations. So what happens? Well, what we would call baseball today, what we do call baseball today, is actually born in New York, but not in Cooperstown, not this little peaceful, bucolic upstate New York village, but in Manhattan, Island, Brooklyn, a burgeoning, fast-growing metropolitan area. And because of all the people that are pouring in, and I won't bore you with the statistics, but it's just the rate of growth in New York City and Brooklyn, which at that time was a suburb, in those from 1820s to the 1860s is phenomenal. And many of these were young men who were coming into New York to become, to learn how to succeed in business, to be clerks, what have you. And there was great concern about their idle time. Were they going to spend it in bars? Were they going to spend it with ladies of ill repute? What have you? And so there was a movement to find healthy, quote unquote, positive activities for these young men. And probably around the 1830s, late 1830s, you start to get clubs formed. And these clubs are really the equivalent of what we today might have, like a book club or a cooking club, or like the Audubon Society, a bird watching club, people who have a common interest and they get together to enjoy that interest. So these clubs are simply people who want to play baseball among themselves. And over the years, culminating around 1845, the rules change and evolve, and we finally get the first set of rules that we know of, at least that have been found so far, around 1845 by the New York Knickerbockers Club. And the New York Knickerbockers Club is a club of gentlemen. They're doctors, they're lawyers, they're young men on the make. So they're sort of the respectable. There's a lot of people who maybe aren't so respectable playing baseball in New York City at this time as well. And in the 1850s, but this time there's several clubs in New York, Brooklyn area. They gather and form the first national group called the National Organization of Baseball Players. And they're all amateurs. Most of their games are, the club would, call a game day, and everybody would show up and they would divide up and they would play baseball among themselves. Eventually then, they start challenging other clubs. And that's when it starts to become more competitive. And that is the path that predominates through certainly by the 1860s and into the 1870s in the New York area, where you have the beginnings of a professional game. Now, a key guy in this, and I'd hope that we'd be celebrating his induction into the Hall of Fame, and I won't go into the details as why he was not named, was a physician who played for the Knickerbockers, a guy named Daniel Lucius Doc Adams. Quite an interesting story about him. If you look at almost everything we associate with modern baseball, 9 men on a side, 9 innings, 90-foot base paths, the position of shortstop, you have Daniel Doc Adams's fingerprints all over it. There's no father of baseball, but there certainly are people who made a big difference and propelled it forward. And certainly Doc Adams would be among that group. Also, it used to be referred to, and I guess still is, baseball is a national pastime. Baseball is a national game. Well, based on TV ratings, I guess you could argue about that today with football. But certainly, you guys are too young. But when I was a child, this is just before professional football really took off in a big way in the 1960s. Baseball was universally acknowledged as the national pastime. Now, it almost immediately was in the in these early years. Walt Whitman, famous writer and poet, who's a resident of Brooklyn, spends a lot of time in New York. We can see, and he's writing about it. And his first quote, in our sundown perambulations of late, walking around Brooklyn, this is from the 1840s. And he loves the game. He's not a baseball player, but he is really enthused about the game. When Whitman got enthused about something, he really got enthused. I've been rereading his poetry lately. I'm not much of a poetry fan, but I'm constantly amazed by the perception and vision that Whitman had of the world that was to come. I mean, this guy is sitting back there in the middle of the 19th century, and he's seeing into the future. And there's a lot of poems that he does, but we're not here to talk about Whitman. The second one is later on in his later years. He dies in the early 1890s. He's talking, but this time baseball is professional, it's established, and he's saying it's the hurrah game of the Republic. It's beautiful. It is just as important in the sum total of our historic life. It fits into American institutions. Now, these Whitman quotes have been around for a while, and if you get into baseball history or American literature or whatever, you're going to see, Whitman always pops up because he has these great quotes. One I didn't know about was somebody a scholar has found a poem that appeared in 1846, I believe, or 45, that was written by Herman Melville, not under his own name, but under a false name. But he's describing a game of ball. Now, again, it could be, there's a lot of ball games out there, a lot of types of ball games out there. And if you have questions later on, I can go into that. But the New York game, the one we just talked about, is the one that eventually emerges as the predominant game. And certainly by the end of the Civil War, it's eliminated the competing versions. But we know, scholars have now determined that Americans were playing all sorts of bat and ball games, even back as far as the Revolution and not before. So I think this is probably what Melville is seeing, one of these early games, but not a very good poem. But that just sort of gives you an indication of how some saw it from the get-go as something unique. And there's no other sports. The only other spectator sports are racehorsing and boxing. And boxing, of course, is in very ill repute. Cricket, an importation from England, actually at this time has a stronger foothold in America than baseball. But cricket eventually, certainly by the end of the Civil War, is also where it exists. It's sort of sort of this quaint little thing that some people play. Baseball has superseded it. So after the Civil War is when the game really expands out of the New York area and into places like Illinois. And very quickly, there are more teams in a state like Illinois than the entire New York metropolitan area. It just is rapid in its expansion. So, and we'll talk about this in a minute. This is a railroad map of Illinois from that period. So why does it suddenly explode? And if you look at the Illinois newspapers, as I've done from that period, it is literally like a mania. It's the latest fad, maybe the latest fad on steroids. They just can't, people, they've never seen it before. Most of them don't play it, but they are all, or significant portions of them, are desperately interested in it. It's all over the newspapers. People come out in the thousands to watch these games. And these are not professional games. These are just games between clubs in one town or with a neighboring city. Well, I think there's a couple reasons why it explodes after the Civil War. Number one, it's a new thing. And, and as we know as Americans, we love nothing more, right, than the latest new thing, the latest craze, the latest fad. But it also has, as I was digging into it, I found how it resonates with some really deep currents in the American character. For one thing, it's a way to get exercise and fun, and we should keep in mind that word fun. That's a really important part. This was fun, fun for players and fun for spectators as well. And it also fits into this thing that a visiting Frenchman named Alexis de Tocqueville perceived in America in the 1820s, what he called the associative principle. And here's this Frenchman coming over to study American prisons, and he ends up writing this great book called Democracy in America, which still is very relevant 200 years after its appearance. And he says, the amazing thing about these Americans, as opposed to the French or the English, is they see a problem or they see a need. They don't wait for some aristocrat, or they don't wait for the government or whoever to tell them, do something about it. They go out and do it on their own. And they form associations. You don't have a library? We're going to form a library association. And that's how most all of our libraries around in Illinois began, as private citizens banding together and creating a library. So these clubs, again, that will result from this, have deep roots in a very, very American reaction to any type of a situation. Secondly, these clubs promote teamwork and behavior, especially behavior, because as we shall see there, this is a game that the ideal is not whether you win or lose, but if you behave like a gentleman on the field. You're not supposed to question the umpire's decisions. You're supposed to yield gracefully in defeat and be modest in victory. The thing we like as Americans that this resonates with, public display. They like all of a sudden now, you don't have military uniforms anymore, but you can have these baseball uniforms. And we'll see down the road here a picture of what some of them look like. And you'll, in these surviving newspapers, you'll read accounts about these young players wearing these shirts and hats and ribbons and what have you, prowling around the downtown streets, watched by young ladies who are very interested in their accoutrements. And finally, what will evolve and eventually sort of take the shine off of it is community competition. Our Peru club will show those stuck-up people over in Ottawa who can play baseball, or Ottawa. Well, we'll clean the clock of those rapscallions from LaSalle or Morris or wherever. So these communities in Illinois who are competing for railroad connections, for commerce, and that fills a lot of their newspaper columns, various schemes. This is another way to compete with their neighbors and show their superiority. I guess I probably should explain this thing now here. This was one of those great ideas. When I had it, I thought it was going to work out. But it doesn't quite work out the way I thought. This is an 1869, 67, 69 railroad map of the state of Illinois. And those little pins represent communities that had teams. And I think Ottawa would be somewhere around in. There's a whole bunch of them around here. The interesting thing about these is if you could see it clearly, you would see these teams follow rivers and especially follow rail lines. This is the Illinois Central that used to go through Decatur and Bloomington, goes all the way down here. Oops, oh well, and we lost that. So Let me see if I can go back to that here. There's no sense in. All right, where will we go? Let's go here. That's an important part. Now, we probably won't go into that unless you have questions, but these railroad connections especially are vital for this intercity competition. And these guys, because there's no, what we would call a road today did not exist in Illinois at this time. Now, there's few teams that travel overland, but it's a long journey and a rough journey. Getting back to the fun of it, it was very interesting in reading these articles from newspapers from Cairo to Galena, Chicago to Belleville, Rock Island to Danville, and every place in between. You can sort of see that on this map. How much fun they got out of the game, even vicariously, by writing or reading about it. And one of the things they most enjoyed was what we would call, what was known then and is known now as a muffin game. Now, a muffin game doesn't involve, blueberry and chocolate chip pastries being tossed around. A muffin was baseball slang for an incompetent player. And so you would see in these teams, in these cities, teams come along. There's a bunch of them in LaSalle County, specifically designed muffin teams. People who really had no business playing baseball, but were going to get in the spirit of fun and join in and make fools of themselves and laugh with everybody at the same time. And a very particular favorite of this was what were called the Fat Men's team. There was one in Ottawa called the Avoir du Poids Club of Ottawa, or sometimes called the Hefty Baseball Club. And this is a quote from the Ottawa paper. The most solid and substantial in the material of its makeup, as will be seen by the list and avoirdupois of its members, i.e. fat. Collectively, they weighed 2,100 pounds. And if you added in their reserve teams, they actually created reserve teams. So you had the first team, the second team, and the third team. You had a total of 5,424 pounds of humanity. And they had special rules, such as no member weighing less than 200 pounds will be admitted to the roster. This club made the mistake of agreeing to play a 5-inning game with a junior club on a degree with 100-degree temperatures. And of course, in Illinois, we know, especially in a river town, 100-degree temperatures also sometimes go hand in hand with 90% humidity, which is what it was that day. And they did this despite well knowing that ambulances would have to be called into requisition should they attempt a much longer game. Other fat clubs around the state actually had rules involving the use of express wagons to carry players from base to base, or no player is allowed to have more than 3 men help him cross home plate. And players that take more than 15 minutes to get to their base will be called out. But there will be small bottles of refreshment. Either they can carry with them or left at each base so they can have a drink of beer or liquor. So this tells us that it was sort of like a very inclusive game. Even if you weren't a good athlete, you could celebrate it either by, making a good-natured fool of yourself or watching other people make a good-natured fool of yourself. And in some ways, these things were more popular and maybe even more attended on occasions than the so-called, better clubs. Also, the game is surrounded with rituals. This goes back to the East Coast. And all these rituals are designed to do one simple thing, and that is dampen down the fires of competition. This is an amateur activity. Nobody's playing for money. The ideal is that everybody will have fun. They will remain friends. They will, glory in the game itself and the exercise and the fellowship and all of that. And so the baseball rules and the guidebooks that came out, and there's a couple written by a New York journalist, Henry Chadwick. The one's called Beatles' Dime Baseball Player, and the other is Haney's Guide to Baseball. And these circulated all through Illinois. So if you're going to start a team, the first thing you want to do would be get one of these handbooks, which included not only the rules, but how to organize the club, the procedures, and how to play each position. And beyond that, what the moral expectations were, what the conduct guidelines were. So that's important to keep in mind, that the baseball that arrives here in a big way, beginning in 1865 and remains until about 1870, is very different in spirit than the game we know today, especially, say, at the professional level or maybe even the college level or high school level. So in Illinois, there were a few places in Illinois where baseball had actually arrived before the Civil War. There were teams in Alton, Chicago, and Freeport. And you'll see occasional mentions. The one that comes to mind is in Bloomington. There was some sort of attempt in 1858 to get something going, probably the New York game in Bloomington, but it sort of floundered. Alton, I suppose because of its proximity to St. Louis. Chicago, same thing. It's a larger city. Freeport's sort of a mystery. Freeport had a very established club, probably a more established club than the Chicago club before the Civil War. So who are these guys? Well, these guys are both pictures are from Centralia. These are we have 4 pictures that I've been able to find of players or teams from that period. There's probably more out there in somebody's attic, but they haven't kicked up yet. The first one, the fellows in white, that is the Liberty Baseball Club of Centralia, Illinois, 1866. And you can see they're wearing long pants. They have caps. They have white jerseys or shirts, and they have some sort of little tie. Now, this Liberty Club is then succeeded in 1867 by the Centralia Egyptians, and this is James T. Cunningham. This is the only really good individual picture I've come across of the player. Could not find any of Ottawa. Boy, if you know somebody in Ottawa that's got some, have them let me know. I'd love to see him. A lot of interesting things about this picture if we look at it. Number one, he's wearing some sort of a chain, which is probably, which we can't tell from this, is maybe holding some sort of a medal that his team has won at a tournament. He's holding in his hand, we know about this, is a gilded ball that they won at a tournament in Decatur. You can see here they have his little logo, which would be CE, Centralia Egyptians. He's wearing, I would think these are probably canvas cleats. Look how big this bat is in comparison to his height. So these bats were not like modern baseball bats. So this guy is very proud of what he's accomplished. He was a pretty good player. He actually lives into the 1930s. He's one of the last of these guys to die. He's a Civil War veteran. He's a very young man, but he had, as a teenager, had served in the Civil War. So again, I talked about the uniforms. This guy's very proud of this uniform and all of his accoutrements. We got a little cross bats here on his sleeve. It was something in a town, a sign of status, to be a member of a baseball club, and particularly be a member of a very good club like the Centralia Egyptians. What was their game like? Well, it was very different. That's one of the reasons I asked about at that picture of Elysian Fields, to sort of see if you could spot differences. One big difference was the size. We saw the bat. I'm going to hold up here, and you really can't tell much. For a long time, I had a regulation baseball not far from my desk, except when I need it and I can't find it. But this is a there we go. This is a recreation of a vintage baseball, one that would have been used about 1858, 1860. And you can tell the stitching is different. It's called the lemon peel ball. It's a little bit bigger. It's not quite as hard. It's hard enough to break your fingers. I can tell you that from personal experience. But it softens up after it's been batted around. And here's one similar that has been, you can tell, battered around. This is another type, the same thing. This is these white ones retain their firmness for a little bit longer than these. These things cost about, well, it varies. Used to be $45 a piece, and now it's down to around 20. There's actually enough teams that use these today to do that. Why could people get hurt? No gloves. Baseball gloves. You don't see a baseball glove anywhere here, do you? No. Baseball gloves don't come along in widespread use until the 1880s. And the last barehanded major league player is still playing in the late 1890s. So by that time, the balls are getting a lot harder. They're being hit harder. They're being thrown harder. So that's a big difference today. As we shall see, the scores are high. Ottawa's best club, the Chabanaz, defeated the Little Vermilion of LaSalle. If you buy from LaSalle, you can brag about this. In 1867, the first time they beat them 89-17. And then, for some reason, LaSalle wanted a rematch, and they lost that game 98-48. This is not uncommon. Maybe it's a little high on the winning side, but these double-digit scores are very common. Why? Interesting question. Well, number one, they're not wearing gloves. Number two, we're talking about people that had not grown up, as most of us have, men and women, tossing balls back and forth, or maybe even playing. Emily did, softball at a competitive level. So catching a ball is a relatively new thing for them. Imagine catching one of these that's coming at a high rate of speed, and you have to really watch it close, because if you make a mistake and it hits up here, you've got a shattered finger. So you're going to have a lot of drop balls, a lot of errors. Also, you could retire somebody if you caught that ball on the first bound. So if it bounced once and you got it before it hit the ground again, that was a fair hit. So a lot of times the fielders would do that. The trouble is, without getting too technical about the rules at the time, if you did that, it was the runners didn't have to tag up. They'd have to tag up on a fly, but they did not have to tag up on a ball caught on the bound, and so the base runners could advance. Pitching, the idea of pitching was to put the ball where the batter could hit it. The pitcher, as the game was originally designed, and for a number of years, was simply a utilitarian person who put the ball in play. And actually, a batter could say, I want the pitch shoulder high. I want it here. And it was the pitcher's obligation to do so. They didn't call balls and strikes, which led to some other problems down the road. That's why they eventually started having balls and strikes. The catchers had no equipment. The guy who played catcher for the Centralia team would have been equipped the same way, except without the chain and the bat and the ball. But he would have been standing maybe about 3 feet or 4 feet behind the batter with no mask, no shin guards, no chest protector. So those guys took a real beating. I talked about the rules, the fly rule. And now, after 1864, though, I should have clarified this, they eliminate catching a fair ball on the bound for an out. They adopt for a 1-year trial the so-called fly rule, and the fly rule has never gone away. And that's the rule we know today. That's why outfielders or infielders have to catch the ball on the fly for an out. But for a number of years after 1865, you can still catch a foul ball on the bound for an out. There weren't benches or dugouts. And under the traditions and rules of the game, you played out the final inning of the game. Even if, say if Peru is playing Ottawa and they're ahead by 9 runs, and at the top of the 9th inning, they hold Ottawa scoreless. Peru takes its bat in the bottom of the 9th inning. Because again, the idea of the game is not to win or lose necessarily, it's to enjoy the experience. And so you want the full experience. You want your full 9 innings. And here's a cartoon. This often happens to pitchers, even today in vintage baseball. I did not mention, and I should have, they're only 45 feet from home plate. You're right up there on top. They don't move that distance that we know today until the late 1880s, early 1890s, the pitching distance we know today. So they're right up there. So you're going to get clobbered once in a while. Looks like this guy is, this fellow over here is trying to indicate where he wants the pitch to go, and he sends it right back and bonks the guy. This happens all the time, by the way, in games during this period. What are some of the similarities? Well, the base paths are 90 feet. That's one big thing. After the 1850s, they're 90 feet. They play 9 innings. Used to be whoever scored 21 runs first won. Wherever that happened, the game was over. And they have 9 players. Before, there could be an indeterminate amount. And in fact, as late as the 1860s, 1870s, a famous New York sports writer, Henry Chadwick, who I referred to later, was trying to get the then Major League to adopt a new rule in which they would play 10 innings with 10 players on a side. And he didn't succeed. So since the mid-19th century, all of the things that we are familiar with, and most of them, 9 players on the side, 9 innings, 90-foot base paths, were put into place. So what about LaSalle County? This is the game that came to them. Well, here are the LaSalle County teams. There was a team at Dayton, at least one, and some of these places I've indicated where there's more than one. Dayton had a team, Deer Park Township, Earlville, Farm Ridge, which is now Grand Ridge, had 2 teams. Forest, Freedom Township, LaSalle had 2 teams. Leland, Marseilles had 2, Mendota 2, Newark, Northville, Ottawa 11, Peru 2, and even Utica. I don't know where they found a flat enough ground in Utica to play a ball game at, but they must have. Now, a lot of these teams, there's a couple things. Multiple teams can indicate at least one of 2 possibilities. One, there was actually a second team. Or 2, maybe it was the same team, but it was referred to differently by different newspapers. Or 3, and I know that's the case in a couple of these places, it was a junior team. It was a team for young men aged 14 to 16. And these were sort of like feeder systems for the senior clubs. So here we have Ottawa. This is not quite the same view. This one's taken closer. This set where this sets today, that was the Clifton Hotel. Interesting story about the Clifton Hotel. It was opened about 1866, 67. It was the first really fancy hotel in Ottawa. And it was such a point of pride that they had an open house. And they decorated the rooms and let people come in. And the trouble was, when everybody was done touring, the hotel owners discovered that a lot of the decorations and lamps and accessories had left with the crowd, and there was quite a story in the newspaper about how dare people do this? You need to bring this stuff back. So we know for sure that this is the general area because all of they were on the few times that they refer to the field, they'll say, on the playing field east of the Fox River. And I worked with a librarian at the Ottawa Reddick Library a few years ago and got into the old maps and plats and what have you. And this was the open piece of ground. I thought for a while it might be Ottawa High School area where Ottawa High School stands now, but that's on the other side of the bridge. So this is I'm reasonably sure is the place it happened. So 11 clubs, Ottawa. These were organized clubs, by the way. As I was talking to Emily beforehand, the bulk of baseball was played by unorganized clubs, just people getting together and, okay, we're going to go out and play baseball. So these 11 in Ottawa are just the ones that have taken the time to, form an organization, have meetings, declare themselves such and such club, and try and have a schedule. The main club in Ottawa was the Chabanaz. They started in 1867. You folks in Peru will love this. In 1868, they were defeated by the Peru Live Oaks. And it was such a stunning and humiliating defeat that the Ottawa Club immediately called a team meeting to determine whether the club shall go under or maintain its old reputation. This was a pretty good loss, 38-16. They got a real drubbing. And so what we see now is the Chabanaz add a player from New York City. So, okay, we're not quite good enough. We're going to bring in somebody who maybe is more experienced, maybe more athletic. This is happening, by the way, I won't go into all over Illinois as it starts to become more competitive. And this would have been a real stinging defeat, I would think, for Ottawa to lose by such a margin to the Live Oak Club of Peru. They do come back in 1869, but they're sort of fading interest. And as far as we know, they only played one game, and they beat Chillicothe by 1 run. But 500 people turned out to watch that game in Ottawa, including 3 justices of the Illinois Supreme Court, which at that time met in Ottawa. But they come back in 1870, and this is really sort of their high point and their low point that season. They reorganize. I'm guessing these guys are probably a little bit younger than the original Chabanaz. They lose at home 31-17 to Chicago's Garden City Club. This is not one of the top clubs in Chicago, but it's a Chicago club, and they see this. The Chabanaz see this as certainly a moral victory. And then a few weeks later, another Chicago team, the Eckfords, come into town, and Ottawa beats them 47-11. Now they're getting pretty good. And that really sort of swells up their heads. Oh, gosh, we just beat a Chicago team. They certainly can't say that in Morris or anywhere else. And then they play a club from Peoria called the Fort Clarks and clobber them. And the Peoria club was so mad, they left the field in disgust, so intensely mad that they did not even treat the Chabanaz with common respect. In other words, they didn't shake hands after the game, what have you. This, too, sort of outside the purview of this program, is happening more and more. In fact, by 1870, Ottawa's a little bit behind, or Peoria's behind the curve. This sort of behavior has pretty much killed off that early wave of enthusiasm. Then they go and beat up on the Springfield Liberty Club, also a junior club, which was one of the best in the state. They're so emboldened by this that they decide we are so good, we're going to go on the road. We're going we're going to show everybody how tough we are here in Ottawa and what outstanding athletes we are, and that'll swell our chests and advance the reputation of Ottawa. And so they announced this tour they're going to take in August. It's going to be 10 games in 7 cities, including St. Louis, Chicago, Wisconsin. We're up into Wisconsin. I think they're going to play Milwaukee, Rockford, Quincy, and Springfield. And on the first stop in Springfield, they beat up on the Liberties again. And they should have stopped in Springfield, because they head down to St. Louis. And there, we have the quote here on okay, I'll leave it. There, quote, the story recounted in the Ottawa paper, quote, "Here they came to grief. Here they were tommyhawked. Here they were martyred. Here they died." We don't know the scores. We don't even know the clubs they played, but we do know they were beaten so severely that they gave up hope. Now, there's various reasons given or speculated at the time. Some is that some of the players were taking advantage of St. Louis beer and whiskey a little bit too much. Other that they ran out of funds. So they never got out of St. Louis. In fact, with the exception of their captain, the players had to walk back to Ottawa. And all this is dealt with in the in the newspaper at the time. Now, the Chabanauds were done. I mean, this humiliation ends them. But there was one game left in Ottawa, and that is the best club in Illinois, the Forest City Club of Rockford. And we've got at least 3 major league players here. Ross Barnes, Addy, the catcher, I can't remember his first name, and of course Albert Goodwell Spalding Jr., Hall of Famer and a very famous guy. This was essentially a professional baseball team. They didn't pay these guys directly. They had jobs, or sometimes they would divide up the gate receipts. And they come to Ottawa, and they have to get the Ottawans have to throw together a pickup team. I think there were a couple of people from the old Chabanauds on there, and they lost 12-2. So obviously Rockford was going easy on them. I mean, if Rockford would have played at its full tilt, it probably would have been 120 to 12, if even like 12. What about other teams? Well, Earlville had a very active club for a time, and but again, with Earlville, we start to see some of these problems that are going to crop up around the state with this new environment of competition, disappointments in terms of maintaining the rituals, also clubs loading up, bringing in other players that aren't on their club to compete with a neighboring city. And that's what happens. The first game they played with Leland, Earlville was, by its own admission, nicely whipped. A few weeks later, they got on train and went down to Leland to play Leland, and they got to the depot and discovered, to their amazement, that they weren't playing the same Leland team. That Leland had created an all-star team to play Earlville, and in fact, had told their own captain, the captain of the Leland team, that you're not good enough to play for us. Learning this, Earlville got on the train and went back to Earlville. Leland itself had troubles. They defeated the Eagle Club of Dayton in 1867, 59-54. That game ended pretty well. At the time, the story recounted the boys and friends took each other by the hand, perhaps to meet no more. That's very much the old style of rituals. Mendota had a Prairie Baseball Club. They were composed of, all these clubs were always composed of the same thing, first-class young men. They played on the public square east of the railroad track. So I'm not familiar with Mendota. Maybe some of you are. You could probably find that today. So what happens? Why does it disappear? Because by 1870, all all of these old adult clubs are gone. Now these adults are probably still playing baseball, but they aren't organizing clubs. They aren't, traveling around city to city. Why does that happen? Well, one is there's lots and lots of disputes over the rules. Not unusual. Today we say, well, so what? Well, at this time, again, that's sort of counter to what the game's supposed to be. That disillusions players, disillusions people. There's also problems about teams bringing in what we would call ringers today, people who aren't members of their club, to improve their teams, which is a violation. Under the rules at the time, no member of a club can play in a game with another club unless they have been a member of that original club for 30 days. And that rule was passed specifically to address that problem. The other big problem is gambling. Gambling is the 800-pound gorilla in the room. And we have a couple of glimpses of it from Ottawa. Quote, scarcely a game is played nowadays in Ottawa and surrounding towns, except there is some betting on it. This low business for men, low business for boys and ladies, it is despicable. And then later on they say, soon our ladies who gamble, and that is the name for it, will want bullfights gotten up in regular Spanish style for their edification, or demand that boxers come to Ottawa and fight for their amusement. Some places also have trouble with fields. We talked about this before the program started, that baseball becomes a nuisance in some communities, particularly Cairo, and Bloomington and Decatur, for example. And in Bloomington, which has one of the best clubs in the state, probably the second or third best club behind Chicago and Rockford, baseball is banned within the city limits. So that team has to go outside the city to play games. Other reasons for fading enthusiasm: money. For these teams to get on a train and go somewhere, Ottawa to go to Morris, or Bloomington to go to Rockford, or Decatur to go to Payne, or whatever, that takes money, takes time away from work, and so their treasuries run out. Rules disputes with other teams, the realities of competition. This is the big thing too. Certainly in LaSalle County, you see this all over the place. The editors always say, well, the only thing the Chaboneaus need, or the Little Vermilions need, is practice. If they just practice enough, they'll get better. Well, practice won't compete with athletic talent on the scale of the Rockford, or the Forest City Club of Rockford, or any really good athletic team. And it takes a while for that to sink in. So, a place like Danville or Springfield or Quincy say, well, okay, this is as good as we're going to get. Is it worth it? Why do we want to go through all this hoopla and spend all this money? We can just play among ourselves and have fun and not have the aggravation. Also, that first generation of adult players are getting older. They move on. They got families. They got jobs. They have careers. They don't have time for it anymore. At the same time this is happening, these junior clubs are rising, and the junior clubs are often better athletes than the senior clubs. Why? Well, these are guys that have now grown up throwing a ball, catching a ball. The game is instinctive with them, whereas the older guys, it's not. Also, the rise of professionalism. We talked about, Ottawa getting this guy from New York. It's really on a major scale in places like Chicago. Chicago, at one point, the Chicago Excelsiors, which in 1867 was supposedly the best club in the state, they actually come downstate and attempt to recruit Bloomington's best players. They get one of them. They go to Rockford and they get Albert Spalding. So they're paying these guys. They're not paying them over the counter. They're saying, we're going to get you this real nice job. You're going to make, twice what the average clerk makes. And you're not going to have to do anything except show up on the afternoons and play baseball. Later on, this is, by the way, this is a team from Harvard. The Harvard Lazy, this is our fourth picture, the Harvard Lazy Nine. I can't find out a darn thing about them. We know there's a club in Harvard. They weren't called the Lazy Nines. So was that the club, and somebody gave them this nickname? Nobody in Harvard knows anything about it, but certainly the uniform style and everything is consistent. This would not, after 1869, they start wearing knickers. And so this is obviously before 1869. Later on, these old players, we know this by a great book I'll point out here in a minute, but Didn't Have Fun, which examines these guys' memories later on in the 19th century. They recall the good times and fun they have. All the problems go away. So, again, the game was primarily for fun, and it wasn't when it was no longer fun, it went away. If you're interested in learning more, and hopefully, if these books aren't in the Peru Library, maybe you guys can get them. But Didn't We Have Fun? An Informal History of Baseball's Pioneer Era by Peter Morris, probably the finest writer today on baseball during this period. If you want to know about some of the fighting and disputes, there's an article that appears in the Journal of Illinois History, a now sadly departed journal, was once published by the state in the winter of 2012, called The Spirit of Discord, Birth Pangs of Baseball, Central Illinois. Another one I did about the problems with playing space, that appears in the Illinois State Historical Journal of the Illinois State Historical Society. And then a book called Baseball Pioneers, 1850 to 70, edited by Peter Morris, very good on teams like the Chicago Excelsiors and the Forest City Club of Rockford. Unfortunately, there's nobody had done the research in detail on these other clubs, of which there were about 1,000 in Illinois, about 1,000 baseball clubs between 1865 and 70. So this is modern vintage baseball, where they play with the rules, uniform, and equipment, or lack of the same, from that period. This is a game indicator some years ago. You can see the different types of modern recreations of the uniforms. This is the Belleville Club. They like knickers, and so does the Danville Club, the guys in purple here. This club in the white and blue jeans, we prefer the old style, as do this team from Indiana. These guys in here, they wear the long pants and shirts. So I will let me take this down and see if anybody has any questions, or if you saw anything in that picture that you thought was different.
Linda, do you have any questions? What made you start looking at the history of baseball in the 1800s?
Oh, well, thank you. I guess the first thing I could say would be it seemed like a good idea at the time, but that's later on, it didn't seem like a good idea at all. I was looking for a journal article to write, which is what that one, The Spirit of Discord. And in the process of researching it, which focused on basically teams in Bloomington, Decatur, Springfield, and Pana, I said, well, wait a minute, there's a lot more going on here. And the only way to find out about it is I'm going to have to get into these newspapers. 10 years later, so I mean, I looked at every extant newspaper, and I said, well, this is nobody's really ever looked at this before. There's a lot going on here. Why did it, and as I went on, then it quickly became apparent, well, it runs like a prairie fire for about 2 or 3 years, and then boom, it's just gone. Well, why? So, and all those answers I think I found. And so at a certain point, I was so far in that I couldn't stop.
I totally understand that.
If I would have known that maybe in 2009 or 2010, I might have said, well, I've got a nice article here about Bloomington, Decatur, and Springfield and Pana. I'm going to let somebody else do this.
Right.
So but that's why it was a lot of it's always, as you probably know, it's a lot of fun looking at these old newspapers on microfilm. I actually bought a microfilm viewer, one of those big old things like
Yeah.
that. I had it in my house. And I worked out an arrangement with the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library, which they would ship the microfilm to Milliken's library. I was living in
Right.
Decatur, and I could check it out and bring it home. And as luck would have it, when I finished the book, they had an executive director of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Museum, who was later fired, who banned that policy. So if he would have done that 2 years later, because I would get up like at, early in the morning, and I would crank microfilm, and I'd come home from teaching, crank microfilm, and you can really make progress. If you don't have to go into a library, and,
Right.
because your eyes stop, oh, I got to do something else. You can't do that. You got to keep going. So that was a lot of fun, but as you know, it's also very distracting because, this is interesting. It had something to do with baseball, but what was that all about? Well, I haven't got time to find out what that's
I
all
do
about.
that all the time.
Yeah, it's one of the joys of using microfilm. I love it. I love it and I hate it. It's it's as you know, it's difficult, tedious work,
Yes.
and you can crank and crank and crank and maybe go through a whole newspaper and not find it.
Right. We look for obituaries all the time, and I get distracted by the price of bread and milk and things happening in town.
There's always something going on. I mean, I talk about in the book, some of these towns had hog stampedes. Yeah, they hogs would run loose in town, and or they would always having dog problems, and they'd have dog roundups, or one place there was sort of like a town cat, and it fell off a roof and killed itself, and so there's a big obituary written about this cat. Old Tom, snatched from life in the prime of his day, which was just hilarious. So I found a way to work that in. So that cat is remembered more than 175 years later or whatever.
Right.
So, and then I discovered that there's only been one other state that has a book like this. That's Michigan, which was Peter Morris's first book. Mm-hmm. And so there's nothing, it'll hopefully inspire other people to look at places like Iowa, or Ohio or what have you.
Right. I hope so. I hope somebody else does.
Yeah, I think they will, but they better have about 10 years. Or
and a lot of patience.
Get a small state, maybe they won't have as many newspapers.
Well, thank you very much. Anyone who's watching this recording afterward, you'll have 2 weeks, and we'll share it on social media. If you guys have any questions for Bob, as long as he's okay with it, I'll put his email at the end.
Yes, great. That's what I put on that last slide. Yeah.
Yes, and we will hopefully have his book in our library later this year.
Well, 2023 now.
Okay, early 2023, early next year.
That's the plan, I'm told. I just do what they tell me. So
that works. We look forward to it.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, and have a good night.
You too. Bye-bye.